Greetings. I'm dr.chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. Today's guest is Dr. Emmy van Deurzen. She's a world authority on existential psychotherapy. She's a philosopher and existential therapist who founded, directed, and developed both Regent's College and the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in London. In 2005, she became an honorary professor with the University of Sheffield and is currently a visiting professor at Middlesex University. She founded the Society for Existential Analysis, its journal, Existential Analysis, and co-founded the World Confederation of Existential Therapy and the Federation for Existential Therapy in Europe. She was the first chair of the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. She has authored over 20 books, bestseller, Existential Psychotherapy and Counselling in Practice, and my personal favorite, Everyday Mysteries, a handbook of existential psychotherapy. In today's discussion, Emmy begins by providing her definition of existential psychology. We then discuss some common misconceptions, like whether existentialism is only appropriate for some populations and whether it's anti-science. Newsflash, it's not. We then jump into the philosophies of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger as Emmy skillfully applies their lessons to everyday life and practice. We talk about the application of time and space and practice, how an existentialist might view the unconscious, and dive into her personal approach, the existential-phenomenological approach. Finally, we discuss meaning, paradoxes, modern-day issues, and end, of course, with a round of rapid-fire questions. If you're interested in any of these topics, feel free to skip around. Hi, Emmy. How are you?
Hi there. I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so there are many approaches to existential psychology, and I thought a nice place for us to start would be to ask you what existential psychology means to you.
To me, it's a very broad definition because I think existential refers to anything related to human existence.
Mm.
So, existential psychology is based on existential philosophical ideas, which are all about exploring the difficulties and problems and limitations and possibilities and potential of human existence. And so there are many, many different sources and different schools for this, both in philosophy and in psychology. There is now, at least a century of a tradition in existential psychology, and there is many, many centuries, millennia, in fact, of existential philosophy. And that is not just in Western philosophy, but as I take it, all around the world.
Mhm.
Because really, from the moment there are human beings, there are people wondering, what are these stars above us? And what are we here to do? How should we live? How should we be with one another? What is the purpose of all this? And those are the big questions that we need to take time to sit with and to
Mm.
begin to muse over and dialogue about. And anyone who does that is doing existential philosophy.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that summary. And this actually leads us quite well into some clarifications I'd like us to enter into about some misconceptions that still exist. Now, firstly, there are those who still believe that existential therapy is impractical and primarily for individuals who are privileged and have time to ponder the universe. Personally, I think this is a little bit of a ridiculous claim, given that existentialism touches on experiences that all humans struggle with, like things
Totally.
like freedom, anxiety, meaning, isolation, death, that sort of thing. And
Mm.
furthermore, I think the argument itself is actually a little offensive because it negates these levels of humanity that clearly exist in all people, regardless of socioeconomic status, right? So now that's not to say that your approach might not differ, right, with individuals who may be lower SES versus higher SES and so forth. But I was wondering if you can speak to more to this and also perhaps elaborate upon how your approach might differ when you're working with different demographics.
Yeah. Well, since looking at existential issues always has a socio-political dimension, it
Mm,
follows that it is entirely appropriate at any level of society and in any culture, and that it always involves looking at the power differentials in a person's life and how they can take ownership of that and find ways to maximize their own ability to take charge of their existence.
mm,
Now, it is also very possible to work with children from an existential perspective because actually, and this is a good example of why it is also relevant at all social strata of society, because children actually are natural philosophers and they
mm,
are always asking these big questions. They are constantly asking why. They don't take things for granted. They
mm,
love to have a conversation about, why should they behave like this, or why should they behave like that, or why I think are things unfair, or what are the limits of what they can do differently to other people. All these conversations are natural to children, and they are also very natural to people of all different groups, whatever groups we're talking about, gender groups or cultural groups, or even if you want to divide people by different psychological problems or emotional problems or relational problems, or even different layers of intelligence, if you would want to go down that path. No matter where you look, this is relevant to people. They're curious about it. They get stuck and upset and confused about these things, and they greatly prize
mm,
having an opportunity to put their questions, to investigate the problems, and to learn to have greater clarity about those things. I really do not see why that should be reserved for people who are well off. I think that's quite ridiculous, that idea.
mhm,
And if
mhm.
it were so, I would not be an existential therapist, I can assure you.
Right. Yeah. A second big point I wanted to hear your thoughts on is the idea that existentialism is anti-science. Could you elaborate on your thoughts in relationship to that one?
No, but that has the same answer in many ways, because
Mm,
the moment you start looking into life and you look at the history of philosophy, philosophy was about investigating life and all its many layers and all its difficulties. And that
mm,
led quite naturally from Aristotle onwards to an
mm,
investigation of physics, of biology, of astronomy, and philosophy led quite naturally in the 17th century to the development of the sciences as well. And so science is a tool for investigating human existence and the world around us.
mm,
And we would be quite naive to exclude the findings of science in how we proceed in enabling people to have better knowledge and more wisdom about how to live their lives. So, of
mm,
course, they're not at odds with each other. They're the exact same investigation, but we
mhm,
go about it in perhaps a slightly different way. So, science tends to focus in very narrowly on one issue, and the sharper its focus, the more likely it is to find out new facts. So it
mm,
analyzes and it focuses, whereas a philosophical approach does the opposite. It has a very wide focus and
mm,
it is capable of trying to see how all these different facts and these different forms of knowledge make sense together, and how you can have a holistic picture
mm,
um, of what it means to be alive and to actually move from knowledge to wisdom, which
mm,
allows people to live in ways that are more in line with their values and their purpose and their sense of who they are, which is something you couldn't do by sticking to scientific investigations. People are crying out for this integration of knowledge and for this wider understanding of what it is all about.
So science focuses on the observable, what can be measured, but existence is also not limited to just that, but there's so much more within it, right? And so we move
Well
into what
put.
it means to be alive and the study of being itself. And if we use more fancy words, we can say that you can bridge ontology with the ontic, right?
Exactly.
Excellent.
Exactly right.
I'm happy to hear that. Now, I think, like, as you've already sort of hinted at, right, lots of people forget that the mother of psychology is philosophy, we could say. And while there are a variety of perspectives, there are also some defining philosophers who set the foundations, right? And again, before jumping into your particular approach of existential phenomenological, I'd like us to, let's say, pay our respects, so to speak, to some of them. And so, what I'd like us to do here is to sort of visit some of the concepts that are a little bit more abstract and have you break down what they might actually look like in lived experience. And is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, excellent. So the first one is Soren Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard provides us with the idea that we operate amongst the background of paradoxes, like how personhood is the synthesis of possibility and necessity. I also like how he describes humans as temporality, resulting from the synthesis of nothingness and the infinite. Now, as humans, we struggle with tensions that arise, we could say, between the paradoxes. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what he means by falling into despair should we plunge too deeply into the temporal or the eternal. Could you maybe begin by sharing what he means by this and how this might look like in everyday life?
Well, for Kierkegaard, what matters is that we become more truthful about what is required of us if we want to live as an individual, as he calls it. So he he challenges himself really, and all of Kierkegaard's writing is really about him trying to get clarity about how he wants to be and how he wants to live. And what he discovers is that, yes, we are always stuck with these tensions and we're always negotiating these paradoxes. So
Mm,
in his system, there is a kind of clear opposition between us being anxious, which is what he calls the dizziness of freedom,
mm,
or becoming or falling into despair is when we kind of give up. So we become anxious when we open ourselves up to
mm,
nothingness, to our possibility, to a whole range of things that we would normally try to forget about. And that anxiety actually gives us the energy to be more fully alive and to
mm,
take responsibility for the way we live.
mm,
And when we despair, which he calls the sickness unto death, it is usually because we're letting go of that effort and we are giving up on ourselves. So we're suffering a loss, and that loss is usually about being really and truly who we are. So it is a kind of movement, and from that I linked that with the emotions because he talks about the importance of anxiety and the importance of despair. And I came to see that really most of our emotions are either emotions of anxiety or emotions of despair. They're either ways of approaching truth and the world and being more alive, or they are emotions where we feel we are losing our connection with what matters and we're having to learn to let go of that.
mm,
So life becomes really a process of ups and downs in the same way in which it is a process of awakening in the morning and allowing ourselves to go to sleep at night. So rather than having to be embattled about our anxiety or our depression, our despair, if we can live with that understanding that anxiety is something that helps us engage and despair is a decompression of that energy where we let go of things, then we become much more at ease with those inevitable experiences instead of trying to shoot them down or remove them from our lives by taking pills. But of course, this requires the capacity to understand who we are and how we want to be in the world. And that understanding is being forgotten about so much. We human beings are very aloof from their own capacity for understanding or for wisdom. They require factual reality and they require to be kept in a kind of comfortable state all the time. So, no wonder there is so much more what we call mental health disturbance in the world, and so many people who suffer from anxiety and depression. This is, really like a huge epidemic, which is still invisible, but people are more and more aware that it is happening. But it isn't really an epidemic. These are people who are trying to come to terms with the human reality that we have to be anxious and we have to despairing, but they just don't know how to
Right.
be in those places anymore. So we are falling short. We need to learn to be better at facing these things, as Kierkegaard was already saying. And we need to teach people. We need to teach people how to be and how to be in ways that are more commensurate with what is possible for human beings. And this takes us back to really the search for wisdom throughout the history of humankind. And if you look at that, you find it everywhere. You find it in the Vedas in India, you find it in Buddhism, you find it in Taoism, you find it in the Athenian philosophers. All of these movements are very, very similar across the board. These movements from 2 millennia ago or even 3 millennia ago, they're all thinking along the same lines. But since we have got this other stream, which is the scientific spirit and this investigative way, we've become alienated from that. And even philosophy is often caught in the trap of that kind of argumentation that seeks to use figures and facts rather than understanding. So this is why we need an existential philosophy rather than just philosophy across the board. And
Yeah.
yes, Kierkegaard is one of those philosophers who in the 19th century was willing to put his head on the line and say, we need this kind of philosophy again, the philosophy that thinks about living.
Now, I think it's wonderful the things that you've said about anxiety, and I will also just throw out there for the audience that it is in line with a lot of the interventions that are currently scientifically supported. Now, it's not that when it comes, the main difference is that anxiety is a given in existentialism, whereas, for example, the DSM-5 or other views view it as a clinical condition,
Hmm.
right? But most of the interventions, they support the idea that anxiety shouldn't be ignored or suppressed, but actually worked through or even worked
Hmm.
with, right? And
Yes.
obviously there would be differences to some of these approaches, but nonetheless, that is something that I think has been very much supported. And I think, Kierkegaard, one of his famous quotes, right, is, of course, whoever has learned to be anxious the right way has learned the ultimate. So it's so prescient of him, we might say, to have been able to arrive at that conclusion so early on.
Yes, but what
Um,
is he saying there? He's saying we need the anxiety, but we also
mm,
need the ability to
mm,
have the right kind of anxiety, or to be anxious in the right way, which means not to be overwhelmed by anxiety, which may lead to things we would diagnose as generalized anxiety disorder or panic attacks, or all kinds of unpleasant experiences that, of course, people shouldn't be troubled with.
mhm,
But there is an other side to it, which is there is also the risk of not being anxious enough,
mhm,
and to live your whole life trying to comfort yourself and avoid anxiety. And if you do that, you're still at greater risk than if you have too much anxiety, which is why learning to be anxious in the right way is the
mm,
key to
mm.
well-being, or being well rather.
Right. And Emmy, would you say that that relates to the sort of finding in psychology that mild to moderate levels of stress is actually conducive for learning and growth? And when
Definitely.
people think about stress, they, as you mentioned, think about it in negative ways, but it can very much be positive and necessary for growth, right?
Totally, totally. And I can tell you from personal experiences, as somebody who used to be very, very anxious and who had to learn to moderate my anxiety, or
Mm,
rather to find the courage to meet those levels of anxiety. So if you're very prone to anxiety, you need larger doses of courage. And I
mm,
think you also need a clearer idea of where you're going with all that energy. You need
mhm,
more purpose. You need more purpose, and you need more inner strength, and you
mhm,
need more courage. And when you can bring all that together, then it leaves you with strength rather
mm,
than feeling overwhelmed by it. But
mhm,
then the risk is that you come to a point where you are so um, kind of used to being anxious that you don't really feel it anymore. And I have noticed that I must allow the anxiety to still touch me in
mm,
order to find the level of vibration in myself
mm,
that allows me to be truly engaged with something. And if
mhm,
I become casual about it, and too clever at suppressing my own anxiety without any medication, but just through force of character, then I'm actually diminishing myself.
mm. Interesting. That's very profound what you just shared. And, some people might think of it as you've increased your capacity to tolerate anxiety, and some people find that as the goal. But you're even suggesting that even if you do increase this capacity, you still need that same level or maybe even heightened anxiety. That actually maybe means that it allows you to take on even larger responsibilities because you can tolerate more, which moves you towards growth, right?
This is
So,
exactly what Paul Tillich said.
mm,
Tillich, who was a philosopher too, but a theologian as well. He said that if you are a creative person, you can tolerate larger amounts of anxiety. If
mm,
you're a neurotic person, you'll probably be trying to suppress your anxiety to having no anxiety because you're intolerant of your anxiety. So,
mm,
what we're really talking about is figuring out how we learn to tolerate. But it's not just about tolerance, it's about working with the
mhm,
energy of the anxiety. And then,
mm,
of course, as a theologian, he added, and his definition of God is that consciousness that can tolerate an infinite amount of anxiety.
mm,
Now, that's actually a very interesting statement,
mm.
because that is a completely different way of looking at God, or,
Yeah.
being. And it is
Mhm,
saying that, in a way, put all of the anxiety in the world together, and to tolerate that, you have to be very steady on your feet, and you have to be very kind of globally capable of that amount of tolerance. And because the internet is exposing us to global anxiety and hostility and negative events, ordinary human beings are now being required to be godlike and to have this infinite tolerance of their own anxiety. And since they haven't got that, they end up panicking about their anxiety, and they end up panicking about the state of the world because they see too much and they know too much and they know they cannot cope with it. So no wonder they then turn to ways and means of lessening that sensitivity. But
That's
that's not the
that's
solution.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating take on modern day affairs. There's actually I have more questions about that, but actually I kind of wanted to rein us in for the sake of time and structure this a little bit
Very
so that
wise, very wise. You reined me in.
so we can touch on some things. So I did want to visit Nietzsche, um, partially because his work is often misunderstood. It was even appropriated by the Nazis, right? And his radical views clearly still impact today's society. So he's well known for identifying how the loss of religion also would mean the loss of the meaning systems, right, that hold humankind from falling into madness. Now, luckily, he also provides us, in a sense, with a way out. And I guess I wanted to give you this broad question of what is his way out, and perhaps maybe what is the Übermensch?
Yeah, well, I'm not so keen on the Übermensch, but I
Mm,
am very keen of on the eternal return,
okay.
because and his concept of amor fati. I think those are much more realistic concepts than the idea of the Übermensch. I think the
Okay.
idea of the Übermensch is that we we rise away from the tension that he noticed there was, in his Zarathustra. He talks about the tension between the aspects of us that are animal based and
Mm,
the aspects of us that are kind of godlike again, or divine in some way. And he sees human beings as a struggle, and he sees our purpose in life to surpass that struggle and to become sort of rise above that. And that's when you access to that phase of being the Übermensch. But actually, I think it is that struggle that is the human destiny and is the human challenge. And this is certainly what we're always working with in psychotherapy. People who come to you are always in that struggle and overwhelmed by that struggle.
mhm.
Now, what is far more useful in Nietzsche in terms of facing that struggle rather than just aiming for, rising above it, is
Mhm.
this idea that it is possible to start living with far more awareness, and to start to see that if you start living every second, every minute of your day in such a way that if it were true that really there are universes that keep repeating the same events over and over again ad infinitum, which
Mm,
some physicists believe may be the case, the
mm,
parallel universes idea, so that each of us actually have a responsibility for creating a particular event, a particular experience, a particular mode of experiencing and living. Then we are in a position where we can make that so that if I were to repeat this moment again and again into eternity, then I
mm.
would be satisfied that that moment would be a good moment. It's a bit like Camus' idea of Sisyphus, that if we are like Sisyphus and we have to keep pushing this boulder up a mountain, and every time we get it to the top, it falls down again. And if that is our destiny, then we must learn to push that boulder up the mountain in such a way that we start to see the value in this, we begin to open up our awareness of the minerals on that boulder, and we start to train ourselves to make that effort in a better way, so that our whole life of pushing the boulder up the mountain is sufficient unto itself. So for Nietzsche, if we live with that idea of the eternal return, the challenge is to learn to live in the way that if we live as we do, we are creating an eternity that is worth having. And this is where his idea of amor fati comes in, which is the love of one's fate, the love of life in all of its facets, the good experiences and the bad experiences. And as it turns out, many people who come to the end of their life start to evaluate their lives kind of in that way. When they look over what's happened, they can see that sometimes the things they thought were negative were actually very full moments in their life and were invaluable in many ways. It links with the idea of post-traumatic growth, which we now know is a real thing, that people who go through a trauma, when they get through that, they look back on that moment of the trauma and they realize this is one of the most important points in their life. Because they were awoken to the importance of their life and what they still wanted to do. B, they realized they had resources they never knew they had. C, they never went back to the same ruts and routines, but they learned to live in a different way because they had seen what was of real significance and real importance to them. And so looking back over their lives, they are grateful that these terrible things happened to them, because those were the times that they came to life.
Sometimes the most terrible experiential states that people are in can also be the most authentic states, and that could really push them or propel them or project them towards further growth. And
Yes.
that's
However, I think Nietzsche exaggerated it sometimes. So when he said, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," there is some truth in that. But let's also remember that sometimes things are lethal and fatal. And if we do get killed, then we no longer have these opportunities of understanding or going beyond our suffering. So let's never idealize suffering, and let's be aware that suffering can get out of hand, and that it's very important to find ways to work with difficulty, but not to increase our suffering
right.
deliberately.
Now, yeah. So now Nietzsche also really believed the body to be extremely wise and intelligent.
Mm.
And in the Will to Power, he makes it clear that because of this, any moral system that seeks to overcome the body will necessarily fail. Now, I've had some people, I believe some people get lost in this sort of idea and believe that it's okay for them to just act out immorally and will act out all of their impulses, and
Yeah.
that that's okay, and that they have to develop a moral system around that. Could you
Yes.
clarify?
Well, that's not at all the objective. It is rather to become aware that your body is a channel through which life touches you, and that to be in touch with that channel is the sine qua non, really, of being truly alive. There cannot be a philosophy or a psychotherapy, for that matter, that is separate from the body. It's got to come through that channel of feeling and sensation and immersion in the physical world, which also means immersion in the world of other animals and immersion in the world of nature around us. And of course, we now know this is very true, that psychotherapy is far more effective if it is combined with people going out there and, walk through the forests or go swim in the ocean or actually do something in a garden, or when people are engaged in a bodily way with nature, they find it much easier to put their troubles into perspective. And when they start reflecting on them again, it has all changed for them, and they have a much broader base from which to overcome and from which to find their strength. So obviously it's not either or, and it's not about chasing the pleasures of the body. It's not about hedonism. It is rather about being also responsible about the way we are bodily and physically alive.
So this sort of also points to the other misconception with him, that the will to power means that the will for all humanity is to empower other people, but it's more about being able to be empowered yourself and in control of
It's
what's
a
happening
different
with you.
definition of power. It's more about strength. It's
Mm,
about being aware of your inner vitality rather than be oppressed by somebody else's power over you. So
mm,
Nietzsche doesn't use power in those political terms. It was his sister who misinterpreted those things in her own way, because she was
mm,
interested in political power when Nietzsche wasn't at all. What Nietzsche
mm,
was interested in is to challenge humanity, really, to
mhm.
reclaim our inner power and our potential and our capacity for doing much more with our years of living on the earth than we are doing, which is
Mm.
a very different story.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Now I'd like us to move on to one more. Heidegger
Uh-huh.
is the third I wanted to touch on. Um, his well, I think a good starting point is perhaps if you can share with us what was his mission when he wrote Being and Time.
Well, that's very interesting. I think he was still very much Husserl's student,
Mm,
and he resented that, and he wanted to apply phenomenological ideas to what he was interested in, which Husserl dismissively called anthropology.
mm,
So, but really was philosophy, and of course Husserl was a mathematician and a logician. So, unlike Heidegger, he was much more interested in the methodology. But
mm,
Heidegger immediately saw how this should be applied to us being much more methodical and much more structurally aware of how we consider human nature and human existence. So that was his project, to
mm,
try to come up with a complete overall description of what it is to be a human being and what that involves and what that means in terms of our existence in space and time, and ultimately how we should live morally. But of
mm,
course, he didn't quite complete all of that.
mm.
In the same way in which Sartre didn't complete that same kind of project.
Right.
Sartre also wanted to go from a full description of human existence to a description of the moral code and the ethics that we should be living by. But he too gave up on the second part of that project
Hmm.
because it's
Interesting.
too difficult to do.
Yeah. Now, one of the words that I think throws people off as they read Heidegger is the word design, right? Or being there is the exact translation, I think, right? Now, what does he mean by design? And, well, let's start with that. That in itself
Yeah,
is
so
probably
so
hard.
Dasein, as you say, is just being there, and he used that term instead of the term human being. But it's much easier to read Heidegger if you translate Dasein simply with the word human being. The reason, though, that he used that term was that he defined human being not as a static thing, but as an action, as what is being in the world. So each human being is like an entity, is like a little bit of consciousness that is being towards something. So another word for that is we are projected into the world. We are thrown into the world at birth, and we aim through time towards the moment that we leave the world. And what we do in that process of being projected into our lives is what makes us a Dasein. It is how we are being there in this life, how we are being in time that has been given to us, as it were. So we are like fractions of time and fractions of space, but we're also a process. So the whole thing is about stopping being a solid thing, stopping trying to be just a biological being, and starting to take consciousness of this amazing miracle that we really are, which is a focus on time and space, which traverses, which travels through us, as it were, and that we transform into what it is we put out in the world. It's a really complex focal definition of what it is our task to be as human beings. And
This,
that was his initial objective, to try and formulate that in phenomenological terms. But of course, he came a cropper. He came to realize that this led to him getting involved in these Nazi philosophies, these National Socialistic philosophies that were about affirming that some people would know how you should be, and that the people who know how you should be could therefore dictate to other people. And he realized this was the natural byproduct of what he had himself been speaking about, but it was not what he intended, and he got lost in it. And so for the second part of his career, his search was a different one. It was to formulate how human beings are actually in relation to being with a capital B. So the emphasis now moves from the individual human being, the Dasein, to the relationship to what is. And out of that, he then gets interested in, well, what does it mean to speak about things? How are we, finding little pieces of being through the words we use? Or how do we relate to being if we use technology in between ourselves and what is? Or how are we in the world when we are in relation to other beings? So it gets much more complex in the second
right.
part of his career. And much
So,
more redemptive, I think. I mean, Being and Time is a dangerous book. There's no doubt about it in my mind. I did my PhD on it, by the way.
yeah, that's why I decided to also ask you about that. Before we jump into the turn and when he moves more into the realm of the ontic, we could say, I did want to just stick a little bit with being in time and just ask you, what does he mean by humans as being the shepherds of being?
Right. Well, humans are the shepherds of being, exactly for the reasons I was saying, because being only properly comes to light through things that are being, through things that are alive. And more than anything else, being comes to light through human beings. So he takes that a step further, and he says because, as far as we know, human beings are the only beings that are not only doing the being, but they're also capable of representing the being and reflecting on that being. Because of that, they are the shepherds of being. They're looking after that being, which is an incredibly interesting concept.
Yeah.
Because it essentially tells you what he believes, although he doesn't say it like that, what he believes the task and the duty of human beings is, which is to look after being. It's like we have been entrusted with this powerful thing, which is called being. Now, this is something that puzzled me from when I was a small child. And I used to say to my mother, if we weren't being, what would we be doing? What else could you be doing than being? And Heidegger takes that quite seriously, which is why, he is so important despite all the things he goes wrong with, because he takes that sort of really by the scruff of the neck and he says, we should do this better. We should be good shepherds to being, and we're not. We're just kind of using up these bits of being, and we're taking things for ourselves in that process, when really we are, I like to say, the guardians of being. So I believe that this is what we do when we're existential therapists. We are the guardians of being, and we ensure that our clients' difficulties are brought back into the light of being, not in the light of pathology or the light of suffering only, but in the light of their full being. And once a person realizes that they're doing something quite mystical and magical just by being a person who is alive and who is having all these experiences and all these encounters and who is doing all these things to the world, then they transform into being aligned with their own capacity for remembering that how they are in the world matters greatly. It matters greatly whether we can live our lives in a full way and when we distract ourselves instead of being thoughtful or feeling or, alive, we forget what we are. And when we, take pills to think less or to fall asleep, we are actually denying the whole process of being in the world and being capable of thought and feeling and sensation and intuition.
When Heidegger speaks about authenticity, it's also not meant in a traditional sense. And with that notion, he says that we actually spend most of our time inauthentic. Could you perhaps elaborate on this a bit?
So for Heidegger, the importance is not for the person to become authentic. It's important to realize that authenticity and inauthenticity are possibilities for us. So to be inauthentic, which is what he thinks we do most of the time, unfortunately, is to be taken over by the world and to be out of touch with what is really going on. And in particular, to not face up to difficulties, to negatives, and most importantly, not to be aware of the reality of our death. And that is not just our death that will happen sometime in the future, but also it's something almost in a sort of the way that Jaspers talks about it as a limit situation, so that to account for the negatives in my life, to be aware of my limits and my limitations, and to be aware of really all the things that I would like to not look at. When I do that by drowning myself in with the crowd and just doing what is expected of me or not think too deeply about things, then I'm going about in an inauthentic way. And of course, this is what we have to do a lot of the time, because we have to go about our duties and we have to do the things that are expected of us. And so we have to be quite casual about things, and we can't go into the depth or have too wide a perspective of what it all means, what we are doing.
Hmm.
But it is possible for us to become aware and to become more attuned to how we are in the world, to be aware that we are feeling into the world, that we
Hmm.
constantly have this attunement to the world, that we are constantly in a mood, that we are constantly receiving and passing on signals in the world, that we're having an impact, and that we're capable of doing this amazing thing called thinking.
Hmm.
And when we begin to do that, and we become aware that we can and will be inauthentic some of the time, but that we can also be more engaged in this authentic way,
Hmm.
then something new emerges. And this is really the key to what Heidegger is after in Being and Time.
Hmm. I see. And he also views anxiety and guilt as important for the human condition. And does this, what you're speaking of being inauthentic and the potential to be more authentic, relate to the call to conscience?
Totally, absolutely right. So it is actually through our anxiety that we
Hmm.
become aware of our death and of impossibility and limits. And
Hmm.
it is through guilt that we become aware of the times and the ways in which we are falling short. Those are crucial. They are vital, because they are the moments when we rise from our inauthentic ways of leaning into life and going about it the easy way, going along with the they, with the
Hmm.
crowd, and not thinking too much. At those moments, exactly
Hmm.
what I was saying about trauma, at those moments, we are activated back into what we are capable of being, and we
Hmm.
become aware that more is possible, and therefore more is actually asked of us.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Um, to sort of connect this now, moving towards your own work and your own thoughts,
Mm.
um, one aspect, well, I enjoy from the work of Medard Boss is the integration of time and space. And of course, among many other people like Minkowski also involves lived time and so forth. But for the audience, Boss collaborated with Heidegger. This is how this all connects.
Yeah.
In any case, my question to you is, or do you consider space and time to be extremely important in your own work, and how have you approached that in sessions?
Yeah, so very much so. So always systematically am aware of how people are in space, whether they are stagnant or in movement,
Mm.
whether that movement is forwards or backwards or sideways, or is hesitant or is confident. And of course, I have created these four dimensions of space, which are basically the physical dimension, the social dimension, the personal inner dimension, and the spiritual dimension, which kind of envelops the whole thing.
Mm.
And the question constantly at the forefront of my mind is, how is this person being physically in the world? How are they moving in relation to the other people in their world? How are they in relation to their inner world? And how are they being in relation to the ideas that give them meaning and that give them values? What is it that pulls them forward? What is their project? Where are they going with this? So it's all about this kind of journey in space.
Mm,
But of course, you have to add to that the dimension of time. So,
mhm,
also, what is happening in terms of how they relate to what has been in their past, and how are they bringing this past experience forward for themselves? Are they just being passive about that? Are they trying to ward it off and not remember? Or are they trying, as Heidegger would say, to go back there, to recollect some of their memories and bring forward back into their
mhm,
present to represent to themselves some of the events that have happened then that I represent to myself now that I know a bit more, in order to integrate that more into myself so that I have a better basis from which to then go on my journey forwards and
mm,
have more momentum to feel that I know where I'm going and to have a better feeling of rhythm with that, a better sort of feeling of the movement of myself in time. And
mhm,
when I'm with clients or when I do supervision, I often speak of that to my supervisees about two figure eights.
mm,
So the client stands somewhere in the middle of that figure eight, and they have to loop back into their past to retrieve things of value and to decide which of their past things they want to let pass and disappear, and which of those things they bring forward to the point where they stand in the here and now. And then what of that do they bring into this imagination, this vision they're creating of a future? And that loops back again into the past. And so there is this figure eight going on all the time. But
mm,
there is also this figure eight between us about what it is they bring into the therapy session and what is happening in my process that I bring back into the therapy session. So there is a figure eight going between us in space as
mm,
well.
mhm.
So, yes, all of those things are alive in the process of the encounter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for clarifying that. You have particular names for those dimensions in space, right? Like the Umwelt, the Mietwelt, the Eigenwelt,
And
and
Uberwelt.
and
Yeah.
Uberwelt, which was the one that you came up with, or at least brought into the
Yeah,
picture.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's prefigured by Platonic ideas, by Hegel, by Heidegger. In fact,
Mm,
it's in many philosophies. If you look at Buber, for instance, when he
mm,
speaks about the two modes of being in the I thou or in the I it, he makes
mm,
that distinction between being in a sort of material world or being really related to the other
mm,
through us connecting to
mhm,
something bigger that is shared. And when
mm,
I address you as fully as I can, what I'm doing is paying some kind of honor to you, some kind of acknowledgement to you as embodying something greater, something spiritual
mm,
that I want to honor, because if I honor it in you, I see more of you and I become more by the same token. And that
mm,
realization, of the way we are with one another affects what we make ourselves into.
mm,
That is so vital. It is key to the
mhm,
future of humanity, I believe, and it is
mm.
much forgotten. I mean, a lot of these philosophical ideas are key to our future, and
Right.
yet so few people talk about them.
Mhm. Now, one of the reframes that I really liked from you, which I'm surprised didn't stick more as more popular, is the movement from psychodynamics to ontodynamics. Onto, I imagine, means ontology, study of being, right? I thought that was very catchy. Now, within that domain, which we've already been basically talking about to many respects, um, I know that the unconscious is somewhat controversial. within existentialism. And I wanted to hear your take on it. Why is it maybe outdated, and what ideas are better suited at this point in time?
As far as I'm concerned, the only thing I disagree with is the idea that there is an unconscious, that is a thing. There is not a place inside a human being called the unconscious. But in terms of consciousness, I mean, it's all about consciousness and how much consciousness we allow ourselves and how much consciousness we open ourselves up to. And it is like with authenticity and inauthenticity is really the same thing. To a large extent, we are unconscious much of the time, because when I do a task, I just focus on that task. I write something and I focus on that and I forget everything else I could be focusing on. I just select a part of my consciousness to focus on one part of the world. But when we start to think about consciousness in general, and we realize that, there's lots of things we have been aware of in the past, there are a lot of things that are to the side of my consciousness, and I can look at or not look at. And there are lots of things in the future that I could bring closer in by planning things or looking at the facts of what is going to happen, what we know will happen, or what is likely to happen. I can bring my attention to bear on different aspects of what I can be conscious of. And as I do that, I make the unconscious conscious. So I play with unconsciousness and consciousness the whole time. It's like light and dark. The zooming in of my camera onto certain things or the zooming out of it, the putting different things within my perspective or out of my perspective make a difference to what happens for me. And so some of the things that Freud spoke about are still relevant. So if a person goes about their life not allowing themselves to be aware of certain events that have happened to them that have upset them, then those things will be constantly knocking on the door of their consciousness. I don't think those things are suppressed into the unconscious, but for the moment that person is unaware of those things. They have been relegated to areas in the world that they are no longer remembering or not focusing on or not yet focusing on. And so the shadow sides of life, as Jung would say, are as important as the sides that are in the light. And if I can only look at what is in the light or what is in evidence or what is obvious or what can be calculated or what can be described, then I'm missing out on a lot of things that are actually important and that define what's going to come into the light. So again, if we were godlike and we were capable of complete consciousness of everything all at the same time, we would just understand. We would just see how everything is connected and how it's clicking away to make certain things happen, and how, what the consequences of actions are, and what the best choices are. But it is not like that. We're all struggling, and so we're all only partially aware. And the big question is, how much awareness can we tolerate? And how much awareness is any single person ready for at any particular time? And there are always areas that people bring about their lives that I can have some view of because of my experience and my understanding, but I know they are not seeing, they're blind to, and what's more, they are not yet ready to face up to that. So there has to be a longer process for them to discover what's in the dark there for themselves. So of course we work with lightness and dark, with shadows and light, and we work with things that are currently not conscious and things that are currently conscious. But what I don't believe in is that there is some kind of reservoir in the brain that is the unconscious. There are
I see.
many processes in the brain.
Right. So instead of sort of static entities, it's more about process and dynamism and connectivity.
Exactly that.
Okay.
Exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the Wiley World's Handbook of
Yes.
Existential Therapy. This identifies four core schools, we could say,
Mm.
right? You have the Zinalysis, you have the existential integrative, the logotherapy, and of course, the existential phenomenological approach. So, first, let me ask you, how does this approach differ from the others?
It's very much identified with the methodology of phenomenology. So
Mm,
we will teach our trainees in very great detail what phenomenology is.
mhm,
They read Husserl's work. They learn to do phenomenological research when they do the doctoral program of training. And they generally get good at understanding how to bring together subjectivity and objectivity and try to see what the essence of things is. So
mm,
that methodology influences the way they will work as psychotherapists.
mm,
I personally like to think that those four approaches have grown much more together than they had been in the past,
mm,
especially since we have had the World Congresses for Existential Therapy, the first one of which took place in 2015 in London, and then
mm,
in Buenos Aires, and then in Athens, and coming up next in 26, it will be in Denver, Colorado,
mm.
um, where we have met from all these different schools, and we have taught each other and had lots of arguments and conversations, and very gradually we're influencing each other and we're using each other's sidelights. And so there is more and more of a sharing of all the different ways of doing things. So we're more and more similar, and less differentiated, I think.
Okay. So you mentioned phenomenology and Husserl, and of course, Husserl. He's very much related to the importance of, or brought the importance of intentionality, right? Which is also linked to Brentano and the wonderful technique of bracketing. I think these could be important for us to perhaps touch on.
Yes. So the idea is, this goes back to consciousness, of course, that when we use our consciousness, as Brentano realized, we do this by using a focus of our consciousness, which he called intentionality. And that intentionality always proceeds in the same way. It starts from my subjective awareness,
Mm,
which directs through a process of taking awareness of something,
mhm,
directs itself towards an object. So there are always these three elements as part of my intentionality.
mm,
And in phenomenology, you can become structurally aware of each of those aspects of
mm,
it. So you can, and if you apply that to psychotherapy, that means, you become aware of how you as a therapist are processing what is happening, your subjective understanding of what's happening for the client in their world. You are aware of the process of your therapeutic dialogue and your relationship, but you can also focus on the story of the client and the philosophical and existential preoccupations that they have.
mm,
So ideally, you do a bit of all three of those things so that you have a more full awareness of what is going on in the
mm,
room. But of
mm,
course, the same thing is happening for the client. So you could equally focus on those three aspects for them. And when you do bracketing, you apply your awareness to this bit of the process that is that we are always assumptive about what is going on. So we're always projecting our own prejudice, our own previous knowledge, our own understanding to what is going on. And when you apply the idea of bracketing, what you are doing is to temporarily put in brackets, like you would in mathematics, your own assumptions and prejudice, to look at that separately and to try and have as clear and as clean a picture of what is really important right now in that therapeutic session. But of course, you can't ever keep it cleanly separate. It's only a method to make you aware that there is bias involved in your perception of the other, that it is never true. It is never true as you could be true in your mathematical calculations. There is always that interference of my bias, which is the angle through which I come to your world. And I need that bias, what's more, because if I don't have an angle, then there is no vision. The light reaches me in a particular way, and that allows me to make some sense of it. I connect it up to things I have experienced previously, and so it makes sense to me. That my bias is also what brings us together, and your bias makes it possible for us to have a conversation. And there's a lot that is not thought through. So, if we're talking about a shoe, for instance, to go to the level of language, I immediately will be thinking about the shoes that I have known in my life and what my picture of that is. But you will have your idea of what a shoe is. But there is enough overlap there. So we're in different worlds, right? We're thinking of different things, but there is enough overlap for us to be able to communicate about it.
Right, right. There's a shared world. It's almost like a Venn diagram, and there are also
Yeah,
differences. And
exactly. It is like a Venn diagram. But the beauty is that in our communication, you're showing me some things of the bits that weren't clear to me, that weren't in my consciousness, and I'm showing you some of what was in my mind. And when the communication feels good and productive, it is because we're connecting in the middle, but we're constantly throwing these sidelights to expand each of our experiences. We each gain a larger grip on our awareness and a broader sense of understanding of how things work. And that's when a conversation is satisfying. And every therapy session should be like that. Every therapy session should have this experience of this enlargement of a person's being in the world and their understanding of what is possible for them and what they can get a grip on. Because that makes you feel stronger, doesn't it?
Yeah. Emmy, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent now, especially because of the time. But for you, is meaning generated, discovered, both? What are
It's
your thoughts on that?
it's all of that. There's so many different ways of making meaning. So what we were just talking about is one way of making meaning. It is to be in conversations with fellow human beings and compare notes about our experiences of existence and compare notes about our feelings and about our purposes and our values, and to therefore get a sense that we are connecting up things in the world. And the more we are making these connections, and the broader our framework of meaning becomes. But we also have other sorts of meanings, which are not shared meanings, but are sort of inner meanings. They are the things that we hold secret to ourselves, and we sort of taste the flavor of something that feels good to us because we recognize it, or it feels akin or familiar. So that's a way to have meaning too. So Frankl spoke about three ways in which we make meaning. One is by taking things from the world and kind of tasting them or feeling them or sensing them and seeing their beauty and experiencing their intensity. And that feels good and that gives you a sense of value and meaning. Or it is by doing things for the world. It's by your work or by doing something for another person. It is about adding some meaning, some value to the world. And then finally, he recognized that there is meaning in having an attitude of being able to bear suffering when you encounter it. Your attitude to everything that happens to you is also how you create meaning. And of course, one of the secrets of that is all the things we've said before. If I have learned to sort of suck the meaning out of something by thinking how it connects to things I've experienced in the past, then I am harvesting enormous amounts of meaning from it. And if I can connect it in my brain to possibilities for the future, then click, 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 I experience even more meaning. So it's all about how much you do this networking with the physical world, networking with the other people around you, networking with your inner world, your memories, your imagination, your future, and networking also. And we've not talked about this a lot yet, but it's very important, to the systems of meaning that we imagine there to be beyond ourselves. So perhaps, we don't know, there are gods or a god, or perhaps the universe itself is a system of meaning, or it is a network of communications or of connectivity. And the more we connect up to that, the more meaning we will appreciate in our own existence. And there is research evidence for that. When people practice some kind of spiritual practice, as long as they keep doing that, they will experience a deeper sense of satisfaction and a stronger sense of being alive. They will have a much more intense sense of being in themselves. And of course, the question is that the objective of life? I don't know if that's the only objective, but it's certainly an objective that works for people to open their minds to all these dimensions of meaning, and their mastery over that, their competency in doing that, indeed their capacity for having virtuosity in being this source of meaning or this connective point of meaning, is an incredibly powerful motivator for people in their lives.
You've touched on so many different fascinating and coincidentally, interesting points, given that a previous interview that I had was somebody who's positing that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, and it's not just a mother sea of consciousness, but conscious agents interacting with each other. Maybe you're aware of some of his work, Donald Hoffman's who I'm talking about. But let me ask you this. So clearly, there are many networks of meaning interacting with each other that we experience as important. Do you think, or are you of the mind, that the universe itself is meaningful, or that it's humans that bring meaning to the universe?
No, I think humans are instruments for meaning. They bring meaning out into evidence, and I think that's our task in a way, to use our consciousness. We are meaning making machines, but we are not the ones who create the meanings. We're doing the job of bringing out what's there. We're a bit like the camera that brings out the picture, but the picture is a picture of something that actually exists. Or we are like the computer, or like the radio receiver that catches the signals and that translates them into something that becomes visible to the eye or to the ear. So yeah, that is what we do as human beings. We make the music, but we're not the creators of the music. We're just the organizers of the music that actually exists, that
Mm.
is possible.
There are some approaches where it's like, oh, what do you value in life or what do you find meaningful? And people are presented with like a list of abstract words and they kind of pick and choose. And I've
Yes.
always found that not to be as effective. It remains in the abstract intellectual realm and doesn't really get embodied or experientially expressed. What I was talking about in my own work is the importance of self-transcendent experiences, the experience of feeling moved. And in this sense, meaning seems to be more of a discovery where you watch a performance or you see someone that you admire and all of a sudden it's not just a psychological tingle, we could say, but your entire psychophysiological
Yep.
system becomes active and it's like, okay, well, that's an experience where there's coherence and agreement amongst all of these levels that you've talked about,
Exactly
right?
right.
And
Spot on.
okay.
So
Hmm.
that's it. You feel inspired because you're back into the flow of this connectivity, and
Hmm.
you feel as if your spirit is being rekindled and it remembers what is possible. And you feel the passion inside of yourself again to become revitalized and live your life in a different way. And this can be triggered in very simple ways. It can be triggered by watching a sunset or a sunrise. It can be triggered by seeing a baby being born. It can be triggered by a wonderful piece of music. It can be triggered by art. It can be triggered by a wonderful conversation that
Hmm.
makes
Yeah.
you feel faith in humanity again,
Hmm.
as our conversation today, by the way. And it can be triggered also by reading a book, or it can be triggered by meditation and sitting in silence. It can be triggered by a dark night of the soul sometimes, when suddenly you realize that it isn't just about your troubles, but it is about understanding why you're having the troubles or something like that.
Hmm.
All these touch points are like the stars on a firmament, and each star reminds you of what you're here to accomplish. And
Hmm.
it puts you back in a feeling of trust in something. Some
Hmm.
people might prefer to call it faith, and it
Hmm.
is of that order, isn't it? It is
Hmm.
seeing that there is more to it than
Hmm.
what I will with my will, or what how I act in the world.
Hmm.
It is about something unfathomable that
Right.
no human being will ever be able to own or sell, or have as their own domain. It is way beyond human beings, and
Yeah.
it is way beyond any individual to fully grasp.
One could say that because us humans are still trying to understand the universe, but still have no understanding of it in its entirety, shows that the universe is simply still more intelligent than we are.
I have no doubt about it. I think the
Mm.
universe is an intelligent organism, which
Mm.
is way, way beyond what we're currently observing.
Mm.
We're just
Excellent. Wonderful.
observing tiny fragments of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's very true perceptually and
Yeah.
might not even be perceiving any of it at all.
Yep.
So, how much time do you have, Emmy? Because I do have some more questions, but I don't want to hold you from
5 more
responsibilities.
minutes is okay.
Okay, okay. So let me ask you one more question, and then I'm going to ask you a round of rapid fire questions that I typically ask of all my guests, if that
Yep.
works for you. Cool. So I know paradoxes are also very important to your framework. And are there any in particular that stand out to you now as a theme in today's society? And are there any particular sort of existential dilemmas that you think is more salient in our society versus, other zeitgeists?
Really, all the paradoxes are incredibly important in our society and often unrecognized. So some of the basic ones are life versus death, kind of good versus evil, strength versus weakness, love versus hate, all those basic paradoxes, which are really not just paradoxes, they're really polar opposites, which create a spectrum on which we constantly move, but we're constantly trying to finesse it. And we're trying to claim the good sides of these for ourselves, pushing the bad sides out to somewhere else. When really the journey of life is a discovery of the whole territory, and we inevitably get to go into the light and into the dark, and into strength and into weakness, all these and even into good and evil, even in ourselves. When do we slip into something that would be seen as evil by another? And when are we doing something that definitely would be of the order of the good for most other people in the world? These are questions that all of us should be asking ourselves, but we're not. We just use these kinds of concepts to create separate zones, and we claim some of those zones for ourselves and exclude some of those zones, but it's not actually like that.
Yeah, wholeness seems to be a principle that lots of individuals struggle with, and the capacity to be able to exist within the tension
And
and grow beyond
conflict
it.
is something people find very difficult to accept. And inner conflict is a very hard thing to work with. But the reality is that the more you can work with that, and the stronger you get, and the more aware you become.
We're ready to jump into some of these rapid fire questions. So, name a book that you love.
Oh, a book that I love. Should it be philosophy or
Whatever
not?
comes to mind. Maybe a book that you love. I'm sure there are many books that you love.
Oh God, there's so many books I love. I love books, full stop. I think one of the books that was most important to me was one of Erich Kästner's book called Lottie and Lisa, which was a book that changed my life when I was a 10-year-old girl who'd had a traffic accident and was in hospital with a head injury. That
Hmm.
was a book that really made me think about myself.
Okay. Name a source of inspiration.
A source of inspiration is nature. It's very important to me. I particularly love forests and I love trees. Old trees really make me feel safe and held. The idea that they're older
Hmm.
than me and will still be there a long time after I'm gone, I find very utterly reassuring. But
Hmm.
another thing that inspires me is my dog. I have a 3-year-old Vizsla dog who is very highly dynamic and very touchy-feely. We have a very close relationship, and I find that immensely valuable.
What did you want to be when you were a child?
Ah, I wanted to be a writer. When I was 7-year old, I started to
Mhm.
write poetry. My
Mhm.
grandfather gave me a beautiful album with in leather covers, which was unheard of, to write my poems in, and I wanted to be a writer. So, sort of done that.
Okay. How about your favorite type of music?
Mm. Well, one of the most favorite pieces of music, I think, will always be Mozart's Requiem. I find that deeply, deeply moving. And when a dear friend died, I listened to it non-stop, and it has kind of become infused with that real deep sense of loss and deep sense of morning, and I find it can plunge me back into that sort of ground of being, at the same time into the sort of ethereal feeling of what is above. And it does have a very big hold over me. But I also love French chansons. I write songs myself, and I write kind of folk music, but they're really more like ballads, like songs that have a meaning. And you can
What,
find
what
those
in,
on YouTube or on Spotify if you want to listen to my songs.
sure. What instrument do you play?
Guitar.
Guitar. Excellent. I do too, actually. I used to be not used to, I'm still a singer-songwriter.
Oh,
So
really?
that's something that's a
Oh,
mutual
wow.
interest here. Yeah, yeah. I was in a band
Amazing.
called Afternoon Dream Serum.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah.
I've never been in a
So,
band, but I always wanted to.
okay. Yeah. I'm sure you have people you jam with, though, no? That you play some
Yeah,
music with?
I've been known to do that. Yeah, also on YouTube.
hmm I'll have to check it out. Okay. What is something about yourself that most people don't know?
Hmm. What is something about me that most people don't know? Uh, Maybe that I paint as well. I
Hmm.
spend a lot of time doing oil paintings, and I'm even part of the village open studios thing on a yearly basis,
Oh,
where I
cool.
show my paintings and even sell some of them. It helps me doing phenomenology. When I do painting, I kind of sort of inside of the painting, and it's like exploring space and time.
Hmm. Fascinating. A heavier question. Do you believe in God
I
or a higher
believe
being?
I believe in intelligence and consciousness
Hmm.
greater than human beings. Yes,
Okay.
but I don't believe in the kind of dogmatic God of any particular religion, because I'm aware those are cultural stories, and I'm interested in those cultural stories, and I'm interested in bringing those together in order to try and expand my own understanding of this greater consciousness.
Hmm. Okay. And I think I might know the answer to this one, but do you believe in free will?
Aha. Well, free will is definitely a possibility. Without free will, psychotherapy would not be possible. The whole point of psychotherapy is that a person, out of their free will, comes to talk about themselves in order to change something about themselves. So the fact that psychotherapy works is proof that
Hmm.
free will is possible. And as a psychotherapist who has worked now for nearly 51 years with that process, I also know we have to be extremely modest about free will. And it
Hmm.
is not something that works like this, or that you order, like you order something online. It is something very hard earned, and your freedom comes to you.
Hmm.
It emerges out of your commitments, and it emerges out of your understanding. And the more you work at that, the more that margin of free will that allows you to transform and evolve becomes a reality. So, yeah, it's
Hmm.
difficult. It's sparingly available in people's lives, but it's definitely a possibility.
Right. Okay. And last question. Favorite philosopher?
Oh, that's a mean question. That's like asking asking me which of my children do I prefer.
Okay,
They're
top three.
all my
Top three.
friends, they're all my friends. I have a soft spot for Kierkegaard, however, but I
Okay.
also have a soft spot for Nietzsche. I think those are probably the ones, that more recent ones I like, but my favorite philosopher of all time has got to be Socrates.
Hmm.
Socrates became my friend in adolescence, and he taught me everything I know in a way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that he is the most eminent philosopher who ever lived, and he gave his life to philosophy
Yeah.
and for truth. And
Mhm.
that is, inimitable.
Mhm.
That is a commitment with such passion and such conviction that it makes me feel very humble indeed.
Mm. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge, wisdom,
Pleasure,
and insights.
great
I'm
pleasure.
sure